Well, hello and welcome to the Learn and Work Smarter podcast. This is episode 67, and today I am interviewing a college professor. Mark Massaro earned a master's degree in English language and literature from Florida Gulf Coast University, and he's currently a professor of English at a state college in Florida. His writing has been published in the Georgia Review, The Hill, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Masters Review, Newsweek, and many, many others. Today's conversation with Mark is so valuable for students and professionals because we are talking about critical thinking. Now, on this podcast, we talk a lot about hard skills such as task management and time management and productivity and resourcefulness, and basically how to put the systems in place so you can achieve your goals, whether that is in the classroom or in the workforce. But often overlooked are some of these softer skills, and I'm reluctant to call them softer skills because they are not soft by any means. And one of these skills is critical thinking. In our conversation today, Mark makes the point that critical thinking is arguably one of the most valuable skills that students can develop in the classroom because it has the greatest impact on their ability to succeed in the workforce. If you are a student listening to today's episode and you have ever had any of the following thoughts: this writing assignment is pointless, reading this book is useless, analyzing this text is dumb, then today's conversation is for you. And if you are a working professional listening to this today and you have ever encountered what Mark calls a brick wall in the workforce where you just reach this no moving forward point in your skills, in your ability to solve a problem, then at the core might be a lack of critical thinking skills. So we talk about what critical thinking is, how to develop them in the classroom, how reading and writing and analyzing literature are the keys to developing these skills, what it looks like when you don't have critical thinking skills, and how a student who develops these critical thinking skills in the classroom is more likely to go on to an industrious, successful, and productive career. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Professor Mark Massaro. Let's get into it. Hello, you are listening to the Learn and Work Smarter podcast, the podcast for students and professionals who want to learn and work smarter. I'm your host, executive function coach, and founder of schoolhabits.com, Katie Azevedo. As a reminder, everything I mention in today's episode will be linked in the show notes, including a link to the transcript, which you can also find at learnandworksmarter.com/podcast. Well, hello, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today. I am excited to see where this conversation goes. How are you doing?
I'm good, Katie. How are you?
Awesome, awesome. So I want to give you a little backstory about why I thought that you would be the perfect person to interview for today's episode. You're a college professor, and so I know that you probably deal with a lot of student resumes or have, read student resumes, and it probably just comes up in your line of work. And this is the season, the spring semester, where I have a lot of college students, either former college students returning to the office, or maybe just, one-off students coming for some help with their resumes for internships coming up over the summer. And as you probably know, there's a section on the student resume for skills. And when I'm working with students on their resumes, it's the basic skills, like, do you know software? Do you know Excel, right? And then sometimes we get into very niche skills. Well, I'm good at marketing. I'm good at sales. Okay, great. But then the conversation comes up about the softer skills. So sometimes that is communication. Sometimes that's problem solving. And of course, it's critical thinking. And on the resume, when students are saying, well, I should put critical thinking on my resume, my first instinct is yes, absolutely. People in the workforce are looking, or hiring managers are looking for people with critical thinking skills. But it often prompts the conversation or me to ask the student the question, what do you know about critical thinking skills? Do you know what they are? Could you even define them? And so I thought to myself this, and they typically have some difficulty explaining what critical thinking really is. So I thought to myself, who would be the perfect type of person to come on the show and chat with me about critical thinking? And I thought, a college professor. So here you are. Are you ready to talk about some critical thinking?
Yes, I love critical thinking. It's
Awesome.
extremely important to me.
It is. It is. Would you agree that some of the students that you work with may not be able to define critical thinking?
Absolutely. I teach literature, composition one and two, creative writing, and all of those classes. The first day, I usually say, before we begin, just so you know, the goal for this class is to develop your critical thinking skills. That's what I try to implement in all my classes because it's an extremely important element, especially these days, of discerning what is logical and what is, emotional. And yeah, they usually just define it by using the same word. It's thinking critically
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. But that's why I really try to stress in my classes, question assumptions, analyze power structures, evaluate human behavior, evaluate history from a critical point of view, so you have an opinion about it based on logic, not just emotion.
That's awesome. I actually have a definition here that I looked up before we hit record. There are so many different definitions of critical thinking out there, and the way that you just defined it is so darn close to the one that I landed on. And this one is from Monash University there in Australia, and they define critical thinking as a kind of thinking in which you question, analyze, interpret, evaluate, and make a judgment about, which would be, synthesize what you read, hear, say, or write. So I'm pretty sure that you just hit all of those verbs in your definition. So pop quiz, you
Yeah,
passed.
nice.
You passed. So my first question to you, I know you teach reading, literature and writing, right? But
Mhm.
how does analyzing literature, we'll talk about writing in a little bit, how does analyzing literature train students to develop their critical thinking skills?
Good question. So this is like what I love in my literature classes is that there's a thing called literary theory, and it's pretty much just a different lens in which we interpret. So it's like we change our classes all the time. Um, in my When I was a student, I had a class just called literary theory, and we read one short story like 15 times that entire semester. Because one way we approach culturally, how does the social norms of the story shape the characters and their identity? Then we read it again from like a Marxist point of view. How does the class struggles of the story affect the characters? Psychoanalytic, the ba most basic psychology class, people learn about, suppressed and repressed desires, how the subconscious affects the characters, feminist theory, gender roles, power structures, and my favorite is actually new historicism. It's what was happening in the culture at the time that made that art.
Mm.
And I always tell the students, history is extremely important. We learn it so we don't make the same mistakes again. But and also we recognize patterns. But also, I think the best way to understand a culture is just look at the art that came from that culture. Because there's something there of expression that numbers and statistics and facts don't really have. So when you start to look at eras through their art, you kind of have this new perspective on what was happening at that time as for a human. So I think just analyzing stories and characters from so many different angles. And, when I read that short story 15 times, it was different every single time. You'd think it'd be boring in the beginning that I have to keep reading this thing, but when
Mm.
we read it from a different point of view, it just like was a new story every time. And this is like extremely important, in law, business, marketing, psychology, social justice, even teaching. I have to always just kind of interpret where is the student coming from? What's their background? How is their biases affecting their objectivity? And then, and it's very powerful because then you start to understand why empathy is cultivated from storytelling,
Mm.
which I think is extremely important,
Mhm.
to understand someone.
Right. No, I love the way that you described it with you keep putting on this separate pair of glasses. So
Yeah,
like you're looking at the same thing with a different lens. And I think that that gives a great visual for students who might be thinking that critical thinking as an idea is just something that's very abstract. We talk on the show a lot. I talk about these hard skills and it's, task management and time management and productivity and getting things done. And these are all skills that people can build with practice. But critical thinking, and I think you would agree, is a skill that we can get better at. It's not
yeah.
something we're born with. Babies aren't, born being able to put on separate pairs of glasses and have compassion and empathy and self-awareness to be like, what is this other person thinking? How could
Mhm.
I view this differently, right? So that's why I think that you're, the perfect person for this conversation because you teach reading and you teach writing and you teach thinking.
Yeah,
And I see such an overlap between those three verbs, reading and writing and thinking. And I don't think you could have one without the other. I think it's kind of like a
exactly.
three-leg stool,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
right?
Exactly. I always just keep telling the students this isn't something you should already like have perfect. It's a skill that you develop, just like playing a sport. Your first day of practice, you don't just go out and immediately score touchdowns and make, baskets. You have to slowly work your way up to it through practice. So that's why in all of our classes, we look at billboards, bumper stickers, commercials, speeches, and we just try to analyze what techniques are they using in order to make you feel something. And then once you
Mhm.
can start putting your finger on, I know what they're using in order to influence me, that's the first step of critical thinking, just recognizing.
Interesting. So I'm curious on your thoughts about I want to be careful and say not say students these days,
Yeah.
but students these days. In my experience, I find that it's hard to get buy-in sometimes from students about the importance of these sort of softer skills, and I say softer with air quotes, but because they're very practical skills, these critical thinking, problem solving. Do you face what I face with my private clients? That when I'm using these words like, oh, it's so important to be able to think critically and we got to come at this from like a critical perspective, because they don't fully understand what that really means and they haven't been explicitly taught how to do this, right? Do you find that it's hard to get buy-in from your students about the practical application of critical thinking? So, for example, if you I ask you a question and then I keep going. But if you were to assign your students a similar assignment like you were assigned, read a single story and read it 15 times and keep putting on separate classes. Do you teach the practical application of this skill in a broader context? Say, okay, well, guys, this is important because you need it for your future classes, for your job, for being a good person, for being able to have relationships. Like, how do you sell it?
There's a reason why a writing class is prerequisite everyone has to take. So in my all my students are, math majors or history majors or business majors, they all have to go through a writing class because those skills are extremely important just for life, personally and, in the job. All of these skills too, once you recognize something critically, you have an opinion of it, and then you support that opinion based on evidence. So immediately it's just logical. And the best thing about literature classes is that there can be more than one correct interpretation. That's why I did good with it, is because, you know, it's not math and science. There's multiple correct answers from it, especially if you just support it with evidence. So it just extends so much outward for the rest of their academic careers. And then after their academic careers, you have a thought, you base it on evidence, you anticipate the counter argument, and then you conclude. And then that's just the most basic skills that you can have in day-to-day life, just existing in the world. I always tell them that cultures are kind of created in order to influence you in a way, the way cities are designed, the way advertisements are made. And as long as you can recognize rhetorical fallacies and appeals and how they influence you, it's the first step of critical thinking is just to recognize that you are being influenced. And then you can, start to develop even more from there.
That's a good point. I hadn't even thought about that as being an angle of this conversation that because I was like, okay, how can students develop critical thinking and how is writing and reading a vehicle to develop those skills and how can that apply in the workforce? But then you just made a really good point that when you understand how to think critically, you understand when someone is using those skills on you in the
Mhm.
form of influence and not necessarily manipulation. I mean, of course, you just mentioned advertising and marketing, right? There's that level too, but even just in day-to-day life, the more you're able to, the more you own a skill yourself, the better you're able to recognize when someone else has that skill and is perhaps using it on you.
Mhm.
That's a great selling point, I would think. If someone weren't buying into why we need to think critically, it's, well, do you want to be fooled?
Yeah.
Do you want to be the fool? Right?
Yeah, that's why there's such a huge like separation between emotional reaction and logical reaction. We do a couple murder mysteries in the class just to have them look at evidence and then make a deduction based on evidence. And I mean, half the time students are like, the wife did it. And then I'm like, well, where is your evidence for that? And they're like, well, it's always the spouse. I'm like, okay, but you're letting, biases and, fallacies influence. It's not a generalization. Not all spouses will murder you. So let's look at the evidence. So that's why it's like we talk a lot about biases, inherited biases, generational biases, cultural biases. As long as you can take a step back and just recognize their own personal patterns of why they behave and think and believe certain things, which is usually just due to culture, that's the first step of kind of just assuming this is preventing me from thinking logically.
Hmm. Hmm. Not that long ago, I think maybe 2 weeks ago or so, maybe 3 weeks, I had put out a blog post about what's the real point of school. And, it's not to learn the Pythagorean theorem and,
Yep.
parallelograms and things like that. It's a playground. It's the only safe, relatively low stakes arena where people can practice these skills because once you're in the workforce, like no boss is going to be like, whoopsies, you messed up 9 times. That's okay. Let's just try again. Like you don't get you don't get 9 strikeouts sort of in
Hmm.
the real world. And so the writing and the literature and that approach to critical thinking and developing these skills, I think that's probably the best way to view this for students. It's like this is your opportunity to practice thinking. Do you
Hmm.
ever explicitly tell students, okay, we are going to read this story and we're going to analyze it through this lens in order to develop critical thinking because it's going to help you in this way? Like, do you lay out that roadmap or do you let them arrive at
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. When we look at, cultural theory, just how the media and social norms of that time have influenced the characters, we can kind of apply it to real world, but also just new historicism. When we look at what was happening in the time that created this, that can just be applied to the job market. Whenever I see a
Mhm.
lot of openings at one university, I kind of think maybe the turnover is for a reason. Also, just we used to work on cover letters in class just because I think that's a skill that everyone should have. And I always tell them, they tell you exactly what they want in the job posting. There's words like cultivate, assess, execute. So they're telling you the words that they want you to use back. And I have heard too that now, there's AI generators that are not letting certain resumes go through because they don't have the right words.
Mhm.
So, I mean, it also comes in handy just for job interviews. You can look around the office of the person that you're being interviewed in and kind of understand what their passions are. I've done that during job interviews where I've just looked around. I'm like, okay, they go skiing and snowboarding a lot. They have a Bob Dylan poster. They have a lot of awards about a certain genre of literature. So then I just naturally work that into the conversation of how I love snowboarding. And I've seen Bob Dylan 3 times. And then it just goes from there. Because you have to understand your audience too. That's another part of critical thinking. And that's a part of the rhetorical situation is just who is the audience. And then you can kind of understand how you're being influenced because you understand what demographic you are.
Hmm. I want to repeat something you said for the listeners because it was so important that you mentioned that a practical application of learning critical thinking skills through writing and through reading and analyzing literature and things like that is the ability to have a conversation
Yep.
in a high stakes situation such as an interview. And again, this just points to the reality that writing and caring about I'm speaking directly to students, caring about a writing assignment and how it's done and not putting it through ChatGPT, not bypassing the actual writing process, which is a proxy for the thinking process, right? That is the one of the only ways that you're going to develop this skill because what's going to happen is you're going to be in a situation where you're having a conversation, you are at a board meeting, you are at an interview, you are in a high stakes conversation, and if you have not developed these critical thinking skills in the other arenas, school, the classroom, you're going to stand there with your mouth open. And you're going to miss a valuable opportunity, as you said, to like read the room, right? To read the audience, to know, okay, so this is maybe what they hinted at in their conversation. This is the backdrop that I see behind them. These are their interests. How can I critically examine this conversation as it's happening in real time and participate in a way that I get the outcome that I'm looking for from this
Yeah,
conversation?
it's an extremely important skill because when I see students bypassing it just by using AI or just any other form of not doing the work correctly, I get nervous knowing that they may
Hmm.
be a nurse or a doctor one day, and then if they cheated their way to get to that position, and I'm lying on their, hospital bed and I need their help, they can't just hit pause and then look up something. You need to develop those deductive skills.
Hmm. Hmm. Question. So what does it look like in the classroom if a student does not have these critical thinking skills?
It's a lot of silence. I can usually tell who's done the reading and who hasn't.
Hmm.
Um, I get excited though when I see new interpretations. When I teach the same, I try to change it every semester just so, it's constantly evolving. That's why I always think the best teaching philosophy is always evolving. It's not just one set way of teaching. But I do kind of understand that this sometimes the students will have the same answers, but every now and then there's just this completely novel idea about a short story, and that can only come from someone being passionate about the story and how it applies to their life, and that just excites me. And I also have one of the justification papers that they need to do an interpretation of a poem but create an artistic expression from it. And then their paper is about that art. So I'm always constantly trying to like be like, you can create something with this. And students have come in the classroom, played the guitar, and they like measured the notes based on the syllables from the poem or something. It's like beyond my comprehension, but it made sense. Students have made video games, comic books, beautiful paintings on canvases, pottery, and then they just, they get to show off their skills, especially photographers. So I'm always constantly trying to like give them something that they can be passionate about, and they usually quickly react.
That's awesome. I know you're at the university level, but when I taught high school, we were shifting toward project-based learning and allowing students to demonstrate. Our assessments look like
Hmm.
projects in many cases. It was a slow rollout, but
Yeah.
I think that, at first a lot of students are like, "Oh, this is the easy way out. I can just make like a picture or whatever." But the students who didn't succeed in those like final projects are the ones who lack the critical thinking skills because they couldn't take the prompt, the argument, the initial reading, whatever it was that was the
Hmm.
backbone of the assignment, and turn it into something because they weren't able to say, okay, well, this is my interpretation. I've looked at the evidence, I have analyzed it, I've evaluated it. Now I'm making a synthesized judgment of what it means, and here is my personal representation of that. And if you think about the potential for these skills to enhance somebody's career, everything you just mentioned, I mean, you mentioned a lot of the arts, but like music playing,
Hmm.
creating even a sculpture, like that is a product, right? So I'm just thinking like larger, like product development.
Yeah.
Maybe not like a clay sculpture, but any product development across any industry requires critical thinking.
Yeah.
And if
Yeah,
it,
marketing,
yes.
policy memos, just everything
Mhm.
that's why I always think I'm like, this is one of your foundational classes for a reason. You need to
Hmm.
know how to think and you need to know how to communicate.
Hmm.
And I always say, unfortunately, I wish that the world was all just based on love. It's
Hmm.
not. You need to represent yourself on paper.
Yes.
Like,
Yep.
especially when I worked a lot of retail jobs in my 20s, and then my bosses would just hand me a stack of resumes and say, find me three people. And the first thing I would do is who has correct grammar, who knows the job that they're applying to, and then not just doing some, umbrella memo to any job. Who's paying attention, who wants this? And then I would always go from like 20 resumes down to like three, just because they represented themselves well on paper.
Hmm. And that's the first step to being able to represent yourself well in real life,
Yeah.
right? For
Yeah,
sure.
it's important.
Hmm. Hmm. So question. So okay, so let me backtrack. I was in a scenario recently, and this scenario happens a lot, but there was one that was more recent that inspired a YouTube video that I put out, not on this channel, it's on my school habits channel, and it was writing tips for students who get stuck. And one of the points that I made in that video was that I hear a lot, I bet you hear the same thing, students be like, well, I just don't know how to say it. Like I know what I want to say, but I just don't know how to say it. And they are under the false assumption that their stuckness, so to speak, is because they just lack the ability to figure out how to say something, as if like word order and sequencing and syntax mattered. And my point in that video is that no, it's not usually that you don't know how to say it. It's that you don't actually know what to say.
Hmm.
And this is in the context of taking, analyzing in the video I use a separate piece, right?
Yeah.
So John Knoll, separate piece, and we take a quote and I throw it up on the screen. I'm like, okay, so let's say that here's our thesis. Here's the quote that we're using to validate our thesis. How are you going to analyze that quote? And that's when students are like, well, I just know what to say, but I don't know how to say it. And I'm like, I really think that you don't know what to say. And I got a comment, and I can't remember if it was on the the video itself, or maybe on like a reel I had made of it, whatever, where someone was like, yeah, but how do I know what to say? And I thought that was a really great question because I'm like, you really analyze the quote.
Yeah.
You tie it back to the thesis. You have to like, you know, um, provide the evidence and the rationale and make it really, really undeniably easy for someone to go, oh yeah, now
Hmm.
I realize your thesis is valid. So when you're teaching your students to, let's say, analyze a quote, what advice are you giving them? Which, of course, this ties directly to critical thinking. You can't analyze a quote if you can't think critically.
Yeah. Yeah, I have you heard of the quote burger?
No.
It's
Well,
um
no.
it's just like just a burger. And then I just say that, the buns are kind of your words, and then the meat of the paragraph is the quote.
Hmm.
So you can't just drop one in the beginning of the paragraph. You can't
Right.
drop one at the end. So I need to know why it's there.
Hmm.
So then, we always just start working on, you have to set up the theme for this paragraph that supports the thesis. And I always tell them, whenever you're in doubt, just ask yourself, does this support the thesis?
Hmm.
So whenever they get to that point of, okay, this theme in this paragraph will support the thesis. Good. Okay, now what quote? And now they include the quote, and then they have to explain why is that quote important enough to quote. Because I always say, like, find the best quote in this entire story to support your claim. If you can just summarize it or paraphrase it, it's probably not that important. So where's the best quote that supports you? And then they do have to make that connection of, they have to justify this quote is important enough to include and quote word for word, cite correctly, and then it also has to go back to proving my interpretation.
Hmm.
So it's extremely important. This happens everywhere, Even as an instructor, though, I constantly have to justify and prove that what I'm doing in my course meets the state, minimums and requirements, the CLOs, the course learning outcomes, the module learning outcomes. Teachers aren't just left alone to go teach a class. We have to justify why this lecture, why this module, why these activities will meet certain standards of cultivating thinking, of, peer-to-peer interaction. And every year we are kind of interviewed of, how are you meeting all of these requirements? And I have to prove it based on the evidence that I'm cultivating in my classes. And this just applies to all jobs, Once you get hired, you're not just not watched. You have to justify you being there. So that's why you need to know how to go above and beyond of just proving your worth through critical thinking.
Hmm. Hmm. No, good point. In education, for sure, to be an educator at any level, you have to have critical thinking skills, especially someone in your position, because you're teaching these and you can't teach something that you don't know yourself. But I'm also thinking, we mentioned this before, but with marketing, right?
Hmm.
You can't know your audience and know what their pain points are and be able to agitate those pain points and then say, hey, but I have the solution, unless you're able to think critically and say, what are their pain points? What are they dealing with? The ability to put yourself in someone's shoes,
Yeah.
sitting around a table, proposing a product. We had mentioned this. And if someone says, well, why is that a good product? Right? To say, I think we should do this. That's kind of like dropping a quote in an essay. And then
Hmm.
your managers might say, okay, well, why do you think that? And if someone comes back with, well, like I just think it would be a good idea. That would be the
Yeah.
equivalent in someone's essay of being like, well, this quote proves the thesis.
Hmm.
And then the teacher writing in the comments, yeah, but how? Right. And then the
Yeah.
manager being like, yeah, but how? Why? And not having a response. I think we're making it very clear for our listeners, whether they are students or professionals, that the ability to think critically is probably one of the most valuable skills you could have as
Yep.
a human.
Yep.
Of course, in a classroom, of course, in the work setting, but as a human, because that's what relationships are built on, right?
Yeah.
To be able to like read the room and what does this other person think? How can I avoid conflict, right? Conflict
Yeah. And that's
resolution.
That's another part, just anticipating the counter argument. How are they going to refute this? And how
Hmm.
can I prove that I'm correct and they're, not as correct? I don't want to say wrong, but, especially lawyers, if you'd had a lawyer that wasn't thinking critically and was just thinking pure emotionally, they would not be a lawyer anymore. You have to prove stuff based on evidence that makes sense logically. So it's the most fundamental aspect of all careers is just the ability to communicate and make deductions based on evidence.
Hmm. Absolutely. Now, I've got a few more questions for you, this
Mhm.
one, and before we wrap it up, you had touched on AI just briefly, and my intention isn't to make this episode suddenly veer into, the presence of AI in the classroom. That
Yeah,
is
it
a
could.
It could. That is a whole nother episode that
Yes.
we'll need to brace ourselves for. Um, but for the students who can technically figure out a way, whether it's through AI or, as you said, through other means of not doing the assignment, let's talk about writing assignments, right? Of course, there's like reading assignments, and you might assign somebody to read something and then annotate it. That's some type of assignment. But let's just say writing an essay in response to a text. And if some student could figure out how to make that happen and hand in an essay that didn't require them to think about their thoughts,
Hmm.
to formulate those thoughts, to justify those thoughts in language, and actually do the work themselves. Those students, and I know you would agree, are absolutely missing the entire point. They're missing the entire point. I think at the college, even at the high school level, but when you're in a classroom, in a writing class, when you're writing anything in the context of learning, you're still in the development phase, which is why we go to school. If you think that the point is the final product, words on a page that met the word count, minimum or whatever, you are missing the entire point, right? You
Yes.
agree? So
Yes.
what for these students, what do you tell them?
Um, I don't let my personal opinion kind of influence teaching. I personally, though, hate AI. I do understand that it's a tool and it's up to the person, how are you going to use this tool for good or for bad? But, I teach about 6 courses every semester and I 25 students per class. And I'd say maybe out of 25 students, 4 or 5 will use AI. And it's just extremely obvious. There's no depth, there's no specifics, especially. A lot of the claims are just extremely abstract and vague. So when even if it's a personal essay, which has happened, where I try to link, themes from the stories or the poetry to your personal life of just there's no wrong answer. All I really ask is like how does this reflect your personal life or your identity? And some students love it. It's their only chance in a college class that they can just sit down and write about a personal night of their life that they felt truly alive. And then a couple students will just wait until the last minute and I'll see it's 11:59 when they submitted and then it's just empty. There's just nothing there. And then when even if I was going to grade it and I have no idea it's AI, it still wouldn't pass the grading rubric. There's no specifics being used. There's
Mhm.
no link between, the theme and their personal life. A lot of those papers will be, you know, since the dawn of man, um, people have enjoyed relationships. Relationships are beneficial because relationships are fundamental to each other's lives. And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. This is so abstract. So immediately they'll just start losing points. And
Mhm.
it just skips this extremely important process, which is what you touched on. It's not about the end goal. You didn't meet the word count. They're paying to be here because they're paying to learn skills that they're going to need for their careers. And when students just, hit a button and then they get work done, they're going to miss out on those skills. And it's obvious by the end of the semester that you didn't develop much and your work never improved. And I don't know what you're paying, you know, I don't know what you're using your money for. You can get a degree, but then the real world's going to be extremely difficult for you because you didn't get the skills that you needed. And I have read that a lot of new graduates entering the workforce are experiencing extreme brick walls of the employers are just firing them because they don't
Mhm.
have certain skills and
Mhm.
they're shocked by it, but I'm not. It's just, hard. And we're not trying to like catch you. Like I always tell the students, I don't want to look at the Turnitin results and I don't want to look at the AI results. It'll break my heart. And then I can't ignore it though. Like I know you
Mhm.
cheated, so I can't ignore this.
Right.
So,
Right. So for the students listening right now, let's say you're in a panic and you, for whatever reason, procrastinated and it's, 11:58 and you haven't turned in your paper. Um, Absolutely reach out to the professor and say, this is my situation. Take some
mhm.
accountability. I procrastinated. Take the zero, right? Take the zero, or maybe some authenticity and some candor. Even in the final, every professor has their own policies,
Yeah.
of course, but like, without a question, do not AI generate that paper, because not only are you discrediting yourself and your reputation, which is like glass, right? Once it shatters,
Hmm.
you can glue it back together, but you see the cracks there, right? You can't fix that. But then you're also doing yourself this massive disservice.
Hmm.
Fast forward, your future self is going to look back, like you said, hit a brick wall, right? You're in a job somewhere and you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, I can't solve this problem. I can't interact with my colleague. I can't do this thing. I can't imagine a worse feeling, thinking like the regret of like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, if only I had just done the paper. If only
Hmm.
I had just gotten over my feelings of like, this assignment's stupid. This
Yeah.
paper is stupid. This is pointless. Is it? If you're looking at the assignment and you're thinking it's pointless, you're missing the entire point. I can't
Yeah.
I can't emphasize that enough. I know you're thinking the same thing.
We were just talking about this actually in a faculty meeting recently, is that some students don't have the critical thinking skills to know how to use AI correctly.
Mm,
So if you don't know how to avoid that abstract answer, and if you don't know how to ask it a specific angle to work from, or something to consider, or certain sources to use, and that's another thing too, is the sources usually don't exist. That's usually what I can tell from writing. One student told me, "That's weird. I don't know why the internet erased those sources." I was like,
that is weird.
I've never heard of that either." It's just that's the most basic thing is that it's a tool, but some people aren't even knowledgeable enough to know how to use the tool correctly. So when it just spits out this generic response, I know it's AI. I can tell a mile
Of
away.
course.
It
Oh
has the
yeah.
same patterns.
Hmm.
So they don't even know too of like it gives me the same patterns every time. So you just need basic critical thinking skills to even know how to cheat in the first place.
Right.
You know?
Right. No, excellent, excellent point. So my last question to you is, and let's steer it away from AI. It doesn't, you don't have to answer this question in the lens of, in the context of critical thinking, but what is your general advice to students who are listening to this right now, who are headed off to college in the fall? Maybe they're juniors now, or seniors now, maybe they're juniors, but they are college bound. Advice from a college professor. Let's hear it.
Yeah, that could be a whole episode by itself.
Mm,
My advice personally, it's the same thing my dad told me when I was a student, is just show the teacher you're trying. When I have some students, I know, out of 25 students, five will kind of disappear. And then the last few weeks of the semester, they'll suddenly reappear and then ask if they can make up, the last 2 or 3 months of work. But then there's the other five students in the group that just go above and beyond. First day of class, they're prepared. They already have books or they have the syllabus printed. They listen to me during class. They come to office hours or after class, they just come up and talk. When I see those students trying, I try to judge everyone fairly. But when I see you're trying your best and you still might not hit exactly where you want it to be, I'm going to still give you good points because I see you're trying. Even recently, last week, I just did a pop quiz in my literature class, and my pop quizzes are just to see who's read. It's not something complex, just who's the character, what's their name. When you're done, flip it over. Um, and then some students get it wrong, and they just blank out and forget. But during class, they answered every question. They led discussions. They showed me that they read. So even though they just left it blank for their quiz, I still gave them points because they proved to me that they read. So that's the thing is just show me you're trying, and I will do my best for you too. Also, I kind of think a lot of professors set it up like, the horse to the water. I put everything in my files, everything in my syllabus. You have to. And then we go over it in class. I even have a Massaro cheat sheet that I give all my classes of just basic writing insights. Don't use the word things in a college paper. Don't use the word stuff. Um, you know, cite correctly. Here's an example. So it's just the most basic things that a lot of students tell me later in life that they've kept and they hang on their wall just for when they're in their careers now. But I give it to all my students, and some forget, some don't pay attention to that. So that's another thing that's a little frustrating sometimes is like I can give you everything in our Canvas files, and the student just doesn't look. They'll just
hmm
email me.
hmm
So just show me you're trying. Show us that you're doing your best. Show us that, you're being responsible, and then we will just shower you with praise. I even have my students, I say if you submit early in the week, I'll give you feedback and you can resubmit before the assignment closes. So on a Sunday or a Monday, when I see a bunch of assignments in, for me, they're already graded. So I kind of got a head start on grading. For the student, they get feedback so that they can fix things. A lot of the students that wait until the last minute to do a lot of things usually encounter a lot of issues, whether technology or just content.
Hmm.
They just rushed and they didn't hit the mark. So that's why I always just tell students, do your best, show me you're trying, submit early in the week, and I'll do my best to give you feedback. And yeah, I'll have a lot of students end my classes with 103, 104% just because they did all the extra credit work. They went above and beyond. And some students just don't take advantage. At the last week, they asked, "Is there any optional work in this class?" And I said, "Yeah, there has been all semester, every week. There's an
Hmm.
optional assignment. Did you do any of them?" And they say,
Hmm.
"No." Like, well, you know,
Yep. Yep. So show up, do your best, be resourceful the best you can
just
when you've,
try. Yeah,
yeah, just try. That's great. That's awesome advice. Show up, do the work, do your best. And when you get stuck, know what your resources are. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark
yeah.
Massaro, for this awesome conversation today.
Thank
Hopefully
you.
it resonates with the students who are in college, who are college bound, and maybe even some folks who are in the workforce themselves and are evaluating their situation and perhaps some roadblocks that they encounter in these very professional scenarios that we talked about, meetings, things like that. And this might give them some motivation to say, hey, maybe it's not my task management and my time management, but maybe it's my actual critical thinking skills. All right. Thank you for your time today, Mark.
Oh, thank you. It was good to see you.
You too. Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Professor Mark Massaro. I love having industry experts on the show so that they can share their unique perspective, right? We talked about that with Mark, that critical thinking involves putting on a new set of glasses and taking someone else's perspective or looking at a situation through a different lens. And if we were to get a little bit meta here, I think that's exactly what we did. Remember, you can find a transcript to today's show at learnandworksmarter.com/podcast/67. And as always, never stop learning.